Good evening. For decades, Americans have been forced to sit through one political temperature tantrum after another from the Democratic Party. Donald Trump was called Hitler, Republicans were called Nazis, conservatives were called fascists, working class Americans were labeled as extremists. Parents at school board meetings were treated like domestic threats, and anyone who dared question the political direction of modern Democratic Party was instantly smeared with every label imaginable. But now, suddenly, the same political movement that spent years screaming about extremists has rallied around a man accused of embracing communist rhetoric, defending radical ideology, and carrying a tattoo linked to one of the most famous symbols in modern history. Tonight, we're talking about Graham Platner. The Maine's Democrat some critics have called Maine's Zohran Mamdani, and according to his critics, that comparison is not a compliment. Because what we are witnessing is not a campaign built on serious policy, it's not a campaign built on economic realism, and it's certainly not a campaign built on accountability. It's political theater, performance politics, social media active wrapped in manufactured working man image. And the deeper Americans look into Graham Platner's public record, the more contradiction they seem to find. For years, Democrats insist the country stood on the edge of authoritarianism. They told voters Donald Trump was a dictator. They said Republicans represent fascism. They warned Americans that democracy itself was under attack. And now many of those same political voices are backing a candidate who has faced numerous scrutiny over old Reddit posts, inflammatory rhetoric, and a tattoo resembling a tofnok, so-called death head, symbol historically associated with Nazi SSS units. Platner has repeatedly denied being a Nazi and says he did not understand the tattoo symbolism when he got it in the military service overseas. He later covered the tattoo and publicly apologized. But critics argue the issue here is bigger than one tattoo. The issue is hypocrisy. Because imagine, just imagine, if a Republican Senate candidate has spent years online making inflammatory comments, describing himself as a communism, and attacking police officers and carrying an image linked to Nazi symbolism. The media would never stop talking. CNN would run a wall-to-wall coverage. Late-night comedians would have a meltdown. New York Times editorials would call it a threat to democracy. But because Graham Platner fits into a certain political lane, because he attacks corporate America, attacks Donald Trump, attacks Republicans, and presents himself as a progressive outsider, suddenly Democrats are talking about grace, forgiveness, and complexity. Funny how that works. One of the central themes of Platner's campaign is the image of the rugged working man, the outsider, the oyster farmer, the blue-collar anti-establishment fighter. It's political branding straight out of a modern progressive playbook. But critics say the mythology surrounding Platner's rise does not fully match reality. Questions have emerged regarding his financial background, family support, and carefully curated image presented to voters. Critics have pointed to reports about family assistance connected to property purchases and business opportunities, arguing that Platner's public persona does not align with his self-made image promoting during a campaign appearance. And this is where the comparison of Zohran Mandami begins to grow louder amongst conservatives, because critics argue both men present themselves as a revolutionary of the working class while benefiting from the privilege, elite networks, and political branding machines. One sells himself as a companion of struggling Americans. One brands himself as a socialist outsider fighting billionaires, but critics say that the reality often looks very different from campaign slogans, and that matters because voters deserve authenticity, not performance art. One of the biggest controversies surrounding Graham Platner involves an old online post in which he describes himself as a communist. Later, Platinum attempted to dismantle some of those comments as jokes, internet trolling, or statements made during a period of personal struggle. But once again, Americans are left asking one obvious question. If a Republican candidate openly described himself as a fascist, even jokingly, would Democrats brush it off? Of course not. They would demand resignation. They would demand investigation. They would call candidates permanently disqualified from the public life. Yet, when a progressive candidate makes a radical statement, suddenly the political establishment wants nuance. Suddenly context matters. Suddenly everyone becomes very understanding. And perhaps most revealing part of the entire story is that many Democrats do not appear disturbed by the rhetoric at all. because the modern progressive movement increasingly threats socialism and even communist language as a fashionable rebellion rather than a dangerous ideology. History tells a very different story. Communism did not produce prosperity, it produced repression, it produced shortage, it produced authoritarian government, it produced suffering from millions from around worldwide. But in elite political circles, radicalism is often marketed as trendy, and critics argue Graham Platner is simply the latest example. Several prominent Democratic and progressive figures have either defended Platner or attempted to minimize the controversy surrounding him. Among the most notable supporters has been Senator Bernie Sanders, and perhaps that should surprise absolutely nobody. Bernie Sanders has spent decades romanticizing massive government expansion, attacking capitalism, and campaigned far-left economic policies. So naturally, a candidate accused of communism rhetoric and anti-establishment populism fits comfortably into the political orbit. Meanwhile, Democratic strategies continue trying to sell Platner as an authentic voice of working Americans, but critics argue that what they are actually seeing is anger, division, resentment, and permanent political warfare. Because what exactly is Graham Platner offering voters besides outrage? Where is the serious economic blueprint? Where is the detailed plan that Maine's fishing industry? Where is the comprehensive strategy for inflation, energy costs? Critics argue most of the campaign message revolves about one thing: opposing Donald Trump. That's it. Bring Trump officials before committees, launch investigations, attack public Republicans, create spectacles, generate headlines. It is resistance politics all over again, and Americans have already watched this movie. Critics warn that Platner's brand of political gain power Maine could face the same problems many conservatives argue are already devastating other progressive strongholds. They point to Vermont under Bernie Sanders, a state critics say has struggled with drug addiction, homelessness, rising costs, and economic stagnation despite decades of progressive political dominance. They point to New York, where critics accuse progressive leaders like Zohran Mamdani and other activist lefts of pushing ideological politics over public safety, fiscal responsibilities, and economic stability. And they ask, why would Maine would follow the same path? Because once radical activism replaced practical governance, the consequences eventually arrive. Businesses leave, taxes rise, public safety deteriorates, and working families pay the price. Critics argue Graham Platner talks consistently about revolutionary and disruption, but disruption is easy, governance is hard, and many Mainers are now asking whether Platner is truly prepared for the responsibility he is seeking, or whether he's simply another social media-driven political celebrity built for internet outrage rather than serious leadership. At the heart of Graham Platner's story is a simple question: who is the real Graham Platner? Is he the working class reformer his campaign advertised portrays? Or is he a carefully packaged political actor playing a role of a frustrated progressive movement representing for his next anti-establishment celebrity? Critics argue the contradiction are impossible to ignore. The self-described anti-elite outsider connects to wealthy donor networks, the working man image surrounded by questions about financial privilege, the anti-extremist party embracing a candidate linked to a deeply controversial image. The Democratic who spend years calling everyone else fascist now defending a candidate whose own controversy would destroy almost any Republican campaign overnight. And perhaps this is why race matters far beyond Maine, because Graham Platner represents something bigger happening inside the Democratic Party, a movement increasingly driven by outrage, performance, radical rhetoric, and identity-based political branding. The American people are not stupid. They see the double standard. They see media favoritism. They see hypocrisy. For years, Democrats demanded Americans fear extremists. Now, critics say that they are normalizing it as long as it comes from their side. And Graham Platner may be one of the clearest examples yet. A candidate wrapped in contradiction, a campaign fueled by outrage, a political movement so desperate to stop Donald Trump that critics say is willing to excuse almost anything. Even rhetoric and controversy would never tolerate from anyone else. The people of Maine will ultimately decide whether Graham Platner represents the future they want. But one thing is certain. This race has already exposed the deep contradictions within modern Democratic politics, and Americans across the country are paying attention. For Englebrook Independent News, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Good night.